You're listening to the Meet the Farmers podcast with me, your host, Ben Eagle. Please remember to subscribe to the show wherever you are listening. In 1924, Austrian philosopher and esotericist Rudolf Steiner delivered a series of groundbreaking lectures to a group of farmers in Kobowice, now in modern-day Poland. His lectures, known as the Agriculture Course, laid the foundations of biodynamic farming, a system of agriculture that aimed to synthesize practical farming techniques with science and spirituality. I'm Ben Eagle, I'm a podcast producer focused on farming and rural affairs, and as Biodynamics celebrates its 100th anniversary this year, I set out to learn more about this little profiled area of agricultural practice. This is 100 years of biodynamic farming. Episode 1: Biodynamic Roots, a Century of Growth. In today's episode, we'll explain what biodynamic agriculture is and delve into the history of the movement, exploring how it began, the philosophies and people behind it, and how it came to Britain. We'll hear from key voices in biodynamic farming circles, including Berni Jarman, who has written extensively about the history of biodynamics. So what is biodynamic farming? Back in July, I travelled to Hawkwood College in Gloucestershire to speak to Gabriel Kaye, Executive Director of the Biodynamic Association. This is her definition of biodynamic agriculture.
Biodynamic agriculture is an approach to agriculture that really respects everything from the mineral, the soil, the life in the soil, the plants, the animals, and the human interventions in working with nature. It's about respect. It's an organic approach, so no chemicals, no synthetic materials, respecting the plant's ability to be healthy in itself when given the right context. How do we give the right context? Well, we were given indications 100 years ago about making preparations for the health of the soil, the health of the plants, the health of the environment.
And more on those preparations later. For now, let's focus on the origins of the biodynamic principles which were established by Rudolf Steiner in his agriculture lectures in the 1920s. Berni Jarman, author of The Biodynamic Movement in Britain, A History of the First 100 Years, explains the context of the lectures.
There was a group of farmers, I believe they were in that part of what was then Eastern Germany, now Poland, Silesia, who were really interested in finding a way of improving agriculture because they'd all experienced how food quality was declining and the vitality of crops was declining. So, for instance, they were, in the earlier days, they'd been able to grow crops of lucerne that lasted 5 years, and now they could do it for 2 years only or something like that. But it was right across the board. They experienced this decline in vitality. And they wanted to know, what can we do about it? So that was kind of the thought which really lay behind it. So they asked Steiner, and he didn't have time. And then the little anecdote goes that the Count sent his son to go and sit on the doorstep until he'd got a commitment to come to give a course of lectures. Okay. So that was kind of what really pushed it. And then the place where it took place was this estate in Kobowice, which was owned by Count Kaiserling, who had a huge amount of land. He was a big landowner in those days. The interesting thing is also that in that part of Germany, or Silesia, it was a very intensive agriculture area. And in a way, that's where they were pioneering the new intensive agriculture and introducing chemical farming. That was happening right there. So in a strange sort of way, the birth of biodynamic agriculture took place right next door to where chemical agriculture was being pioneered.
At this point, let's go further back in time to understand who Rudolf Steiner was and the context of his thinking. Born and raised in Austria, Steiner became a student of the works of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, perhaps the most influential writer in the German language. In 1888, aged 27, Steiner was invited to work as an editor at the Goethe archives in Weimar and remained there until 1896. Whilst he studied other philosophers, Goethe was arguably Steiner's most significant influence. I spoke to John and Alison Chapman, former academics who now farm biodynamically in Galloway in southwest Scotland. Upon moving to their farm, they discovered that they were situated in close proximity to the former home of another disciple of Goethe, the Scottish polymath Thomas Carlyle. They explained the context of Goethean influence in Britain more than a generation before Steiner's impact.
Goethe was already an established writer and dead before Steiner could have come across him. He based his work on Goethe's reputation as a scientist, and so did actually Carlyle. He wasn't just a poet and a dramatist. He was a serious scientist with meticulous observational skills. And he's the one who said there is nothing in nature which is unrelated to the whole. That is Goethe, straight, absolutely. And that's what really triggered the transformation in Carlyle's emotional response to his life events, because he had been in a spiritual dilemma. He didn't know what to think. And Goethe, just by being there and by being his friend and someone with whom he could have an intellectual conversation of a similar caliber, he became his guru, really. And in the same way, even though he was long dead, he was published. And so Steiner was able to go back and see exactly the same, but in his own native language. So the combination of the two made an international universalization possible.
At risk of going down a rabbit hole, I want to pause briefly with Thomas Carlyle, who is linked to Steiner through their shared Goethean influence, albeit a generation apart. Carlyle is important because he was a key figure in translating some of Goethe's work to English, including Wilhelm Meister's Apprentice, but also as an independent thinker about many topics, including the environment. Here's John Chapman.
The story of Carlyle is one of his contribution to the Enlightenment of the early 19th century. He coined the concepts of industrialization and of the environment. But of course, it's particularly in relation to the idea of the environment that his dependence on his connection with Goethe was fixed. But of course, Goethe's ideas were also transferred in parallel with that by Steiner at a much later date.
The broader importance of Carlyle in our story about biodynamics comes from his linguistic work in preparing the ground in the English-speaking world for Goethean thinking.
Steiner was dealing with his native language, whereas Carlyle studied German in order to facilitate this knowledge from von Goethe coming into a bigger, wider European and American, even more importantly, to exchange information and ideas. In other words, it was part of both Goethe and Carlyle's thinking about universal culture. And for that, you need a universal language. And English was becoming a universal language.
Steiner himself has left a vast legacy of written works. The standard edition of his collected works runs to 422 volumes, including 44 volumes of books, essays, plays and correspondence, and over 6,000 lectures. After the First World War, he became active in a wide variety of areas, from education to architecture to medicine and, of course, agriculture. He founded schools, the first of which was known as the Waldorf School, of which there are now hundreds worldwide. But what of his agriculture course? How did his agricultural lectures in 1924 develop into a globally practiced method of farming and growing. Berni Jarman.
Yeah, there were about 130 people present at the course, and most people, if they were asked, what did you make of it? They said, I thought it was fantastic, but I can't remember a thing about it. You same sort of thing. But somehow it lived as an inspiration, even if they didn't quite know the details of what it was that was brought. What sort of was passed on was really this having a new imagination for nature and agriculture, which could then be taken forward. And of course there were practical indications which were then worked with, of course.
At this point, you may be wondering what biodynamic farming involves on a practical basis, especially the preparations that Steiner refers to in his lectures, perhaps the best known aspect of biodynamic methods. These preparations are added to compost and are a key component of what makes a farm biodynamic today. Gabriel Kaye, Executive Director of the Biodynamic Association, introduces the preparations.
Winter soil one, which is made from cow manure with a horn. That is a really important scientific interaction. It's not random. We've only discovered that in the last 10 years because science has become subtle enough to show what's going on. But that maturation of a form of compost from the manure in the horn is absolute magic. The science shows it's magic. So that what comes out is a perfect soil activator, activating good bacteria and good fungi. So that's one of the field sprays or garden sprays. And the other one is made from silica that has also been matured in a horn buried in the ground, but at a different time in a different way. And that is therefore an affined form of silica. It's very, very fine, and it goes through a further transformation of refinement when it's in the horn. And that really helps each plant to find its own shape through working with the mineral world. And we are increasingly discovering that our food and our plants and nature are getting deprived of minerals. And this silica preparation really activates that mineral possibility for the plants. So it's something also really incredible. How did Steiner know that that was what was needed? And the other preparations are made from medicinal plants such as the dandelion, chamomile, yarrow flowers, valerian flowers, and also then bark from the outside of the oak tree. So you take just a little bit of the surface bark, you don't damage it. Nettle, the whole plant is buried in the ground, and it again forms a form of super compost. So these preparations then work within a compost heap in the same way as you make an organic compost heap. You use plants, you use manure, whatever you can find in the way of organic materials, and then with the biodynamic method you put these preparations into that heap, and that helps stabilise the process of composting.
In the years following Steiner's lectures, his ideas took root in various parts of Europe, including Britain. Daniel Dunlop was particularly important in the fostering of Steiner's ideas in Britain, as Berni Jarman outlines.
How it came to Britain was then that the scientific advisor to the Count who'd organised it was invited to come to Britain by Daniel Dunlop, who was at the time, well, he was very involved with the anthroposophical movement, but he was the one who actually was running this power conference. He was an engineer and worked with the whole electrical industry and developed these power conferences, which carried on then ever since, in a way. Even after his death, they continue, but in a slightly different way even today. But at that time, that was something which he was really carrying. And out of that, really, he had this experience of arranging big events. So he arranged a big conference in London in 1928. This was to actually a conference all about spiritual science and the work which Steiner introduced. So for that, he invited representatives from all the different fields of work that had been started and developed, amongst which was, of course, the new form of agriculture, which didn't have a name at that point, but it was just this new agriculture that had been launched in Kobovitz. And for this, he invited the scientific advisor of the organizer, who was Count Kaiserling, to come to England. He wanted the Count to come himself, but he wasn't able to, so he sent his scientific advisor. And of course, having come to Britain, he was immediately taken on, and he's stayed ever since, as these things sort of happened. So that was like the beginning, and then they decided that the work in this country should really have a form. So the research circle, or the experimental circle, which had been founded during the conference in Kobovitz, was founded in England as an English section of it, so that the experimental circle, bringing together people interested in developing this work, could come together and work on it. So this was the experimental circle of the English-speaking world. And that's still going today.
By the 1930s, several farmers in the UK had begun experimenting with biodynamic techniques, but it wasn't until after the Second World War that the movement really gained traction.
Well, that came about through this conference I mentioned with Carl Meyer, who came from Kobovitz. He became the first advisor to farmers, and then more growers and farmers slowly started taking up the work. There was, of course, Maurice Wood was the first one, and his example showed what could be done as well. And of course, the agriculture course was then translated into English, and that was then an important moment as well, so that other people could then actually see what was said directly. And that took place in the early 30s.
As the movement grew, the formation of organisations and groups like the Anthroposophical Agriculture Foundation, founded in November 1928, the British Experimental Circle, and the Biodynamic Association became central to spreading and establishing Steiner's principles. The Biodynamic Association has played a key role in promoting and developing biodynamic farming in Britain.
The Biodynamic Association was basically started in 1928 as an impulse to bring biodynamic agriculture, which had only just started 4 years previously in Germany, to the UK, to give it a centre, to give it a grounding, to give it a contact point. So that was called the Anthroposophical Agricultural Foundation at that time, and that continued till 1951-52. And also a Biodynamic Association was started in 1934, and the two came together after the war, and that's where the Biodynamic Agricultural Association, which is our official name, was born out of these two coming together. And it's not that biodynamics was that different, it's just they had different approaches, and they did work actually to some extent together. Many of them using the same consultants and lecturers and researchers. So it was then brought together as one organisation after the Second World War.
The association not only helps certify farms, but also offers training, resources and advocacy for the biodynamic movement.
It's a big task because most of the farmers and market gardeners' vineyards in the UK sell direct or really short chain locally, and for the produce and for the consumers, that is the best way. But it does mean that it's less visible because you don't see Demeter produce so much. There are some online supermarkets that have biodynamic produce as part of their choices. Also, some of the produce that goes out by Riverford or Abel & Cole, again, is Demeter certified. So there is a bit of visibility, but that's the online ordering side of things. If you go into your local supermarket, it's very unlikely that you will find Demeter produce. And if you go into the health food shop, there will be some, but not a large amount, because of selling directly to the local population is the best for the freshness of the produce. And that's what we're about mainly in the UK.
While I was visiting Hawkwood College, I met Berni Courts, a senior researcher with Ruskin Mill Trust, an educational charity that utilises practical land and craft activities to support the development of work and life skills in young people with autism and other learning difficulties. Berni has experience across education and practical growing. Speaking with him made it clear to me that biodynamic agriculture cannot be removed from the wider context of Steiner's philosophy of anthroposophy. We're not just talking about food production here, but a whole way of living and seeing the world and other people. Berni told me of the importance of providing places where people of all abilities can learn by doing, and described an experience and realisation he had when working in a previous role.
So in a way, I'd done a kind of organic apprenticeship, and then I went off to work under the tutorage of somebody who was a trained biodynamic farmer. And I met something really interesting in that the young people, so it's an educational farm, where we were offering real life, authentic experience for young learners with additional needs. And I met something there which was extraordinary in that these young people who largely had been told they can't found out that they could. And what I mean by that was with the seasonal nature of the agriculture that we were doing there, and working with nature's rhythms and working with biodynamic principles of trying to create a farm as an organism, trying to create an individuality. So these are, the kind of biodynamic principles, that there was something in those young people that those principles role modelled something to them. So the attempt to create something which every organ had a relationship with every other organ on the farm. So they could see themselves as whole, and they could see the farm as whole, and they could also see that this individuality that belonged to a place was also kind of replicated in their own being as well. So from being told that you're not or you can't, they could then see that you can and you are, and that's a very, very different set of circumstances to walk into educationally. So what we've done at Ruskin Mill Trust over 30 years, we've taken the principles and the practices of biodynamic agriculture, and we've used them as an educational background or an educational process. And so when you walk into a Ruskin Mill farm or garden, you meet biodynamics, but not kind of worn on the sleeve, but in practice. And so what's very interesting is when the public walk through and you're a farmer there, they'll quite often stop and go, "Oh, this is different, what's going on here?" And you say, "Well, this is a biodynamic farm, And then sometimes they go, "What does that mean?" And then you have to choose what level you have your conversation, because you don't want to meet people with, what's considered to be really out there esotericism. You want to meet people in a conversation where you can say, well, we work with the rhythms of nature, and we understand that there's a living soil organism, and that plants can regenerate the soil, and that we want to produce healthy food, and actually we want to create environments that are not just interesting for people, but the environment is actually interested in people as well.
This philosophy is also clear in the Camp Hill movement. Camp Hill began in Scotland in 1939, inspired by Steiner's thinking around education and social life. Camp Hill communities are designed to offer people with learning difficulties a place to live, work and connect with nature. I spoke to Catherine Powell, who worked for many years in the dairy at Loch Arthur, a working community near Dumfries in southwest Scotland. Catherine worked alongside many people with learning difficulties and told me how the community works.
The community works on the basis that everyone has a skill, and it's a question of finding the job that suits them, and work is very much integral to the community's life. So is socialising and partying, I have to say, and caling and all these things. But giving people a purpose and a sense of pride in what they do. I can remember being visited by somebody who was almost smirking at our sort of disjointed production. What they couldn't see was that what we were doing was we are making jobs along the production for the people so that they get a sense of achievement from it. And for example, by the time we reached the yoghurt stage and we poured all the yoghurt into pots and got it in the incubator, there would be how many litres of yoghurt have we made today? And that would go back to the houses as a report from the people that were working in the creamery. It was a great sense of achievement. This is about us showing the world what can be achieved by these people who are often sidelined. And that's what I feel about the community. It was attention to the small thing. And that's, I think, where biodynamics comes in. But everything is, you go into I don't know if you've visited Loch Arthur, you go into their houses. Their houses are warm, welcoming, homely places.
Yeah, for
They're
sure.
people's homes. And that has always been the way. And since I've been connected with the community, shall we say, my generation of people who live in the community have retired, and there are younger couples coming in to run houses now. Loch Arthur have a lot of employees now, but they do have still what they call career volunteers who are mainly couples with families who run houses.
In the next episode, we'll return to Loch Arthur, as well as meeting some biodynamic farmers from other farms to look ahead to the future of the movement. But what are the legacy of Steiner's work? His lectures on agriculture were given near to the end of his life, as he died in March 1925. He didn't therefore live long enough to experience the practical side of his theory of agriculture. Nevertheless, his ideas developed and biodynamics is now practiced in 55 countries around the world. This said, what relevance do the lectures themselves have today? Here's Berni Jarman.
The lectures are basically the source and the root of it, and I think they will always be very much at the heart of the development. And you can always read them and find something new or interpret them in your own way, but the spirit of them behind there still remains. And I think it's got a lot to do with an imagination of nature. You know, you can't sort of pin it down and say, well, this is a scientific fact that we're building on, although of course they are facts, but it's much more an imagination of how we work. And out of that imagination, then you develop the farm or the social surroundings of the farm and then allow it to develop forward.
For Gabriel Kaye at the Biodynamic Association, Steiner's lectures provide the inspiration for a biodynamic practice that has evolved since the 1920s and will continue to evolve.
If we start cutting it down to a method and forget about the inspiration and the wider understanding that those lectures can engender, then we will lose the life in it. Biodynamics is something that has evolved over 100 years and will go on evolving. What it aims to do is always be providing inspiration and method for healthy agriculture, for healthy nature, and the more we learn, the more we can evolve it. So let's go on learning, let's be fit for the future. What's happening now is enabling the soil on biodynamic farms to be more like a sponge. It takes in water, it holds water, so there's less flood runoff when there's really bad storms, but there's also less drought because there's more structure and soil organic matter to hold water so through a dry period. So it's a sustainable system, it's a regenerative system. It's a system where the nutrients are held carefully in the soil. They are valued, they are nourished by the preparations so that that soil is held in good heart and can go on giving us good food.
That brings us to the end of this episode. In our next episode, we'll be looking at how biodynamic farming is practiced today, the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead, and how the movement is adapting to the 21st century. This podcast was presented and produced by Ben Eagle for RuralPod Media. To find out more about our work, visit ruralpodmedia.co.uk or find our podcasts on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this podcast. Special thanks for this episode to everybody who contributed, including Gabriel Kaye, Berni Jarman, Berni Courts, Catherine Powell, and Alison and John Chapman. Thanks also to Hawkwood College and the Biodynamic Association. This episode was presented and produced by Ben Eagle.